Thank you for that roaring introduction. I love being introduced by different people because it's always interesting to hear how people think of me. I am by trade an actor, and I have been acting since I was 6 years old, which is more than 3 years. And well, physically, not mentally. And I am very happy to be here today to present my authentic self to you. I'm even wearing a nice gay top. So here we go, talking about querying up your database. I am Randolph West. I normally have an about me slide, which is definitely in this slide deck as well. But I just want to, before we get there, cover the abstract so that you're in the right session. If you've ever used a true or false statement to represent gender in a database, this session is for you. I'll talk about small changes you can make to be more inclusive in your database design with the least amount of effort. And I'm emphasizing small and least amount of effort for a reason. That can make all the difference to the people using the systems, because I get that there's a lot of stuff going on every day, and to be more accommodating to the people around us, it helps if the changes that we need to make are small but meaningful. So this is the About Me slide. I didn't put my face on this slide because I'm right here in the little box on the bottom of the screen. So you know what I look like, and I'm the one who's talking. But if you want to know more about me, I am an author, an actor, an activist, which means I make loud noises about equality and accessibility. I'm a consultant. I like C#, and I love SQL Server. My pronouns are they and them and theirs, but it didn't fit nicely when I laid it out that way. And then my email address is the important thing on this slide, because you can contact me about anything I mentioned in this session today. At the bottom of the screen are logos. I love logos. I have a Microsoft MVP award. I am a member of the Azure Data Community Advisory Board, which is the board that talks to Microsoft about the community. So if you're a user group leader or member and you have issues with how things are being handled and you'd like to send some feedback to Microsoft, come and speak to the board. Data Saturdays is a venture that was started after PASS went away, and it is managed by a whole group of people, and we sit in a sort of loose committee, and I'm a member of that committee as well. And then bornsql.ca is my website. There are 3 books about SQL Server that I've written. I've also done another book, which I guess I should have put on here. I did a chapter in a book with Melody Zacharias called Let Them Finish, which was a sequel to Let Her Finish. Re-Merit, I don't want to get the surname wrong. Re is one of the co-authors of that book, and we spoke about what it means to be part of a group that is not straight white male. And that's probably the book I really should have mentioned on the slide instead of the technical ones. But let's get to it. Let's look at inclusive table design. This is the first time I'm presenting the session because I designed it specifically for this conference. So if I run out of time or if I have too much time at the end, it's my fault because I didn't plan it correctly. But if we do have time to discuss things, then let's do that. I'm going to firstly show you some statistics about various things, because we're not going to just talk about the one topic that's mentioned in the abstract. Then we're going to ask ourselves, do we really need to store that information? We're going to ask if you've thought about your audience. Have you designed a table or a database for your audience or for your employer or your organization? And have you thought about how those two should work together? We're going to talk about technical implementations of these things. Of same is a nice little old-fashioned English terminology of saying technical implementations of the things that we just spoke about. And then brunch, because this is a joke about the gay agenda. So here we go. Some statistics. Let's talk about mononyms, or people with one name. Yes, we're not talking about gender just yet. People with one name. Well, we know about Madonna and Cher, but let's talk about this in a more global context. Mononyms are a thing. In other words, they're significant in these areas: Turkey, Iceland, Indonesia, North America, India, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and other places. Lots of places have folks with one name only. Or by convention, they have one name, and that's their first name, and then their surname or last name is just a capital letter of the beginning of their surnames. So the point here is that your database design, which might have first and last name or first name and surname, isn't going to be conducive to everyone in the world. And I mentioned North America as well, because there are indigenous people who have one name. And a lot of the database design websites and blog posts and books that I've read talk about, catering to a North American audience. But in this case, North America is not just the US of A with white people. There's also Mexico. People tend to forget that Mexico is in North America as well. So there's a lot of things that you have to take into account when you're designing tables that you probably aren't thinking about because it's not in your worldview. So I mention all of these areas because you may not be thinking about this if you are not planning to go global, but bear in mind that even in your local area, you might have to consider things like this. So mononyms. Folks like Madonna share Teller from Penn and Teller, Pele, the football player, and Björk, the singer. Now, Björk is an interesting case because in Iceland, they do have surnames or last names, but the names are based on their father's names and then whether they're a son or a daughter. So it is Björk, the daughter of father's name. And I haven't written it here because I cannot pronounce it, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. So conventionally, Icelandic people go by just their first name, even though they may have two names. And then historically speaking, we've got a bunch of people who have one name. Often they've been Latinized. So you'll have Confucius, which is definitely Latinized. You've got Cleopatra, which is probably not how it was pronounced in ancient Greek. Socrates, or Socrates if you're English. Liliuokalani. See, I haven't had my coffee yet. Plato and Colette. These are just some names that you may or may not have heard of who have one name. So please keep this in mind when you're designing your database. So how does that look? Well, let's look at surnames. I am married to a South African. Well, turns out I'm South African too, but I'm married to a South African who has a 3-part surname separated by spaces. Van der Westhuizen. Van der Westhuizen is a very common Afrikaans surname, but it has 3 parts and it's a very long name. It's not long where I come from, but it is long when it comes to database design, because for some reason, people think that surnames are short. So think about multi-part surnames. Surnames that contain spaces, surnames that contain special characters. For example, apostrophes. The Irish surname, well, Conan O'Brien. O'Brien has an O apostrophe Brian. There's O'Kelly, which is O apostrophe Kelly, and names like that. There are last names that have the 2 parts that have been squished together because of worrying about how the Americans are going to pronounce things, but then they will still have a middle letter that is capitalized. So you may have a rule in your data capture that just does the first letter capital, which is incorrect. Surnames that are the word null. I wrote a blog post a few years ago based on what somebody was talking about on Twitter, because let's face it, Twitter is my life, which is why I'm taking a break right now, that are the actual surname null, the word null. And when they export the name to a CSV file, and the CSV file gets to that field and says, well, nothing's there, so I'm just going to skip it. We have to take into account things like that. And then family names that actually come first. My best example of this, and it's not quite universal, but there are a lot of countries that have it, but my best example is South Korea. So, any questions about names before we continue?
I don't see any questions, but there's been really great conversation about dealing with the mononyms and some of the different subcultures and hyphens, and so it's a really great conversation that's going on in the chat.
That sounds good. All right, so let's move on to gender and sex distribution. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson, because it wouldn't be a session by me if I wasn't a little bit teachy as opposed to preachy. I don't like preaching. So I've got a link at the bottom of the page, which you can get later. But what it does is it gives a little bit of, information about the gender spectrum. Sex and gender are bimodal, not binary. Binary means only 2 values, 1 and 0. Binary has the convenience of being only two values, and so it was used to represent sex and gender for a lot of databases. And even today, people are designing databases that have two values, true or false, 1 or 0 for gender and sex. And the default seems to be that 1, true, is male, and 0 or false is female. Let's not even get into the details about women being false, but the whole point here is that it's bimodal, not binary. Bimodal means clustered into two average groups with some overlap. There's overlap in gender, and that's an important thing, and sex as well. That's an important thing that we need to talk about here. Approximately the same number of redheads in the world exist as there are intersex people, and you can say that the other way around. So between 1 and 2% of the world's population is redhead, and between 1 to 2% of the world's population is intersex. In other words, when they were born, the doctors looked at their physical attributes and said, not sure. Okay, let's say male, or let's say female, or let's do surgery and then say they're female. So yeah, and then there's gender identity, which is it seems to be a fairly new concept in the world these days because we're more aware of it, but gender identity has been a thing for hundreds of years, just by the way, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next. You may have heard about pronouns. Pronouns are not always reflective of sex or gender. So a person might have the pronouns he/him, and their gender might not even be male or masculine presenting. They may be a lesbian. And well, there's another kettle of fish that we can unleash and talk about, but we don't have 6 hours and lots of time to get into the nitty-gritty. But pronouns are not always reflective of sex or gender. So when somebody says, my pronouns are he/him, or they/her, or they/them, or ze/zer, or xi, or any number of what we call neopronouns or new pronouns, words that we haven't heard before because they're new, we may instantly react and say, well, I've never heard of that, therefore it's not a thing. That is, I've written about this in the book with Melody, that if you can remember a Starbucks order, and let's be honest, Starbucks orders can be complicated, you can remember somebody's pronouns. I admit, it's tricky at first, but when you start including it into your worldview, it's just another thing about somebody. It's another attribute about somebody that you can learn. I know that when I make tea for a friend of mine who comes to visit the house, that they take 2 sugars and no milk. If I can remember that, I can remember their pronouns. So one more thing about pronouns, which is a little preachy, and I apologize in advance because I said I don't like being preachy. If you don't know somebody's pronouns, it's okay to say they/them. But if they do tell you what their pronouns are and tell you that they and them is incorrect, please use the correct pronouns that you've been provided. That's my preachy moment done. This is a bimodal distribution graph. This is an actual data set with no context, and that's the point of the slide, is I'm giving you a graph and you have to guess what this is. And you can come off mute and try and guess what I'm showing you here while I take a sip of coffee. I just want to point out while you're looking is that there's a little bit of blue on the left here inside this graph where there's a lot of pink, and there's a little pink bit here in the middle. So any guesses? No one? Okay, cool. I'll put you out of your misery. This is my sleep pattern. My sleep pattern is bimodal. In other words, sometimes I fall asleep at 2 o'clock. The latest I've fallen asleep is around 4:30 to 5. And most of the time I wake up in this distribution, and I told you that 9:30 was early for me. And sometimes I've woken up at 2:15 and stayed awake the entire night, which was me 2 nights ago. So the point is, this is what a bimodal distribution looks like. You've got 2 general areas. You've got the left values, which in my case is when I fall asleep, and the right values, which is generally when I wake up. But there is some overlap. Now, the gender distribution is the same. The sex distribution is the same as well. You've got two general clusters. So in our case, we're talking about male/female. And inside there are different distributions. There's a peak where the average is. So there is an average on both sides. But then outside of that average is a spectrum. And in that spectrum is where a lot of people lie. When you're talking about 7 to 8 billion people in the world, those small percentages add up significantly. So even though in our heads, and humans are very bad at numbers, I've discovered, especially numbers with big scale. So while I've spoken about, for example, latency, network latency, I talk about the fact that there's a billion nanoseconds in 1 second. So therefore, a millisecond versus a nanosecond it's a millionth of a degree difference, right? It's humans are bad at numbers. So when we talk about 1 or 2%, it sounds like a small value until you provide the context that it's 1 to 2% of 8 billion people. So although the number of people who don't present as the same gender or sex as what's on their ID is small, it's not a small number of actual people. So keep that in mind. We're not talking about 10 or 20 people worldwide. We're talking about millions and millions of people. In fact, out of 8 billion, we're talking about 100 and, let me get this number right, 160 million, 2%? 16, yeah, 160 million. I think that's right. Yeah, numbers are hard, but that's a lot of people. So the next question is, do we actually need to store this information? Do we need to store somebody's gender? If so, why? Do we need to store their pronouns? If so, why? Do we need to store their legal names? If so, why? Do we need to store any identifiable information? And this goes to GDPR, this goes to identity theft, this goes to a number of things. But do we need to store social security numbers? Do we need to store credit card numbers? Do we need to store information? That should be your first question when you're designing a new database. Do you need to store the information? The answer is usually no. If you're not legally compelled, and I'm using the word compelled here to store it, don't. Don't store gender, don't store date of birth, don't store social security number or other identifying numbers, and don't store the legal name unless you're legally compelled to do so. And as far as gender and sex are concerned, for medical reasons, for insurance reasons, sure, there may be reasons for that. But generally speaking, if you're just using a marketing database, you probably don't need that information. And this is where I'm going to go a little bit off book, and that's why I was looking for this phone earlier. I'm going to read something to you from a Vice article, and I will provide the link at the end because I found this after I set up the slide deck. Excuse me. And this comes from Vice. It was written in 2016, so this is already 5 years old, this article. A new survey of young Americans aged 13 to 20 years old, also known in marketing speak as Generation Z. So we had Generation X, Gen X, which is my generation. We had Generation Y, which is also known as millennials. And now we have Generation X. And in 2016 already, so 5 years ago, we were talking about people who were already 13 to 20 years old. So these folks are now almost legal age majority in all cases. So Generation Z, if anybody says millennials are 20 years old, they're lying. So anyway, Generation Z has found to be more open-minded and permissive than their older millennial counterparts when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality. According to a report by trend forecasting agency J. Walter Thompson Innovation Group, only 48% of Gen Zs identify as exclusively heterosexual. Now, that bimodal distribution I showed you of gender is the average worldwide, would be those two peaks, right? But if you're looking at younger people, and this happens to be the case with a lot of things that change over time, younger people are more adoptive of new things, right? But again, gender identity is not a new thing. It's just that we're more aware of it because of the internet. So only 48% of Gen Zs identify as exclusively heterosexual, compared to 65% of millennials aged 21 to 34. So they tried to adapt to the age scale. On a scale of 0 to 6, and some of you who may be watching this are aware of the Kinsey scale, which was a guy who did some research and was used by Kellogg's to create cornflakes because cornflakes stopped you from masturbating. I'm not kidding. On a scale of 0 to 6, which was the Kinsey scale, where 0 signified completely straight and 6 meant completely homosexual, more than a third of the young demographic chose a number between 1 and 5. In other words, only 24% of the older counterparts more than a third compared to only 24% of their older counterparts identified as somewhere in the middle of the gender spectrum. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that's something that you should be aware of. Yes, the younger people seem to be more, it's not trending. I promise you it's not a trend. It's not this, there's no agenda for people to take over the world. It's just that we're more aware of it because of the internet. The internet has democratized how we share information. So people are being more open with how they view the world. And because of that more open approach, we're more aware of things. It's not that there's more people who are queer. It's not that there's more people with ADHD. It's just that we're more aware of it and people are talking about it because there's no stigma attached to it, or there shouldn't be. So let's talk about your audience when you're designing the databases itself. We're using a link here from patronmanager.com/blog-the importance of gender inclusivity in your database. So we're talking about gender here, but this does apply to other things as well. Have you heard of an honorific? An honorific is a drop-down list that you might add to your database when people are filling it in that says, are you Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or Miss or Professor or whatever? And generally the list is very male-centric because why not? And there are very few options for people who don't identify with any of those descriptions. Honorifics were created mainly for marketing reasons. So when you send an email, you can say, Dear Mr. Weissman. Sorry, I was trying to think of a straight person I knew. And I don't know very many because that's a choice I made. That was a joke. That was a joke.
I feel honored.
Dear Mr. Weissman, please be advised that your overdraft has been approved. You can now buy your $1 million house at the beach, and everybody's happy. But then how do I choose an honorific? There's no honorific for me because there just isn't one. I would have to choose one and feel unhappy about my choice, or I would be able to choose none. Well, why do you need an honorific? If it's for marketing reasons, take it away. You don't need it. It's less data to store, firstly, even if it is only a lookup table that you're using. But why do you need it? Have you thought about your audience and who would be using your database and why they would want to fill that in? If it's for marketing reasons, take it out. You don't need it. That article that I referred to, the Vice article, also goes into details about what people's shopping preferences are, and that younger people are now shopping outside of their gender identity as well. So whereas millennials would have chosen, I think it's about 54% of millennials will shop at a store in their gender identity. So they'll go, if they identify as male, they'll go into the boys section, or if otherwise they'll go into the girls section. But 54% is a very low number when you think about it, and that's millennials. So if you're talking about Gen Z, which is the new generation, or Gen Z, there you go, Ree. If you're talking about the new generations, that diversity is even broader. So marketing has some very fixed ideas in its head about gender separation and toys for boys and things like that. But in many cases, and I won't say often or most, but in many cases, that is completely wrong. So don't store it. Do you cater to mononyms? Do you cater to people with just one name? Do you cater to short names? Well, now that's a weird question. Why are you asking that? Well, I went to school in South Africa, and one of the classmates that I had, his last name was H.O. because he was from Asia. So no databases that he filled in ever accepted his last name because it was only 2 characters long. Because for some reason, I don't know what it is, but people have decided that you cannot have a last name shorter than 3 characters. What? Why? What are you hoping to avoid? Well, maybe it's a design decision because of the fact that your search stored procedure has been limited to 3 characters or more because you don't want to hit the database too much. Well, guess what? You're going to have to change how your search algorithm works because you are ignoring a whole group of people who only have 2 characters in their name. Or let's talk about people from Asia in their local alphabets who only have 2 or 3 characters in their name anyway because you're storing Unicode now. How do you cater to short names in your database. Stop putting a limit on the minimum length of your names, please. And do you allow renaming? So this is a personal bugbear of mine because I am male presenting. I look male. I sound male. Everybody calls me he. But I changed my surname when I got married. Now, in Canadian law, I don't have to change it legally. I can change it just in use. So my name, Randolph West, isn't the name on my ID. But in every single database where I have to go and put in my name, I have to put in the name that's on my driver's license. And I feel a little bit worse every time I have to type it in because it is a name I associate with poor memories. So it feels bad for me. Now, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is trans, who is trying to get rid of their previous name, their dead name, and they're unable to do so because their database that they're trying to access doesn't allow renaming, it doesn't allow editing. So that's something else to consider. Do you cater to non-Latin alphabets? I already mentioned it for Asian names, Korean alphabet, the Japanese characters, Chinese characters, but also Turkish. Turkish is a very good example of characters that look like they might be Latin alphabet, but they're not, and they have different pronunciations. Another example is the Cyrillic alphabet. Russian and Greek use a similar alphabet. They're both called Cyrillic, but they have different characters in them. So if you're not catering to your audience correctly, you could be storing the wrong information. So please be aware of these things when you are storing data. And do you cater to multiple genders? Ooh, what does that mean, Randolph? Well, guess what? I might have multiple genders. What do you mean, Randolph? Well, right now, my gender might be, what do I use now? Non-binary, that's the one. And the reason it took me so long to figure that out is because I used to go by genderqueer for a long time. And then sometimes I'll be agender and sometimes I'll be profanity. And because it's none of anybody's business. So depending on your audience, they may change their mind about what gender they are today. And that's okay, because that's the whole point of this stuff is that you probably don't need to store it. And if you do, you need to be considerate of people's wants and needs. So let's put this all together in a way that is practical for DBAs and database designers, developers. How do you store a name? Don't use first name and last name. Just store a full name. I've put a little asterisk there, which means that you need to consider temporal tables. Because we just spoke about dead naming, we spoke about people who want to be able to edit their names, but you may have data that is dependent on old information for legal reasons. Let's say you need to do an auditing report of medical history, and before somebody transitioned, you need to get their information for insurance reasons. And so if you use temporal tables, you can store the old information and then the new information at the same time. And depending on the query that you use, you can get the information as it was at that point in time. So temporal tables are very useful for data like this. Do use a preferred name. What is a preferred name, Randolph? Well, I'm so glad you asked. If I'm going to be putting in Randolph West in every single full name field, how do I want to be addressed? How do I want the emails to be addressed to me? Well, that's where I'd put in Randolph. So it's kind of sort of the same thing as a first name, but it is more generalized to the world at large. So if I want somebody to talk to me directly, whether it be through customer support or through marketing emails, that's what a preferred name would be. So put in my full name, but my preferred name is how you would address me. And then please don't make an honorific a required field. Don't require me to choose Mr. from a list, because I'm going to look for the none. And if I cannot find none, I'm not going to fill in the form, which means I'm not going to add my data. And if that means that it somehow prevents me from using your system, I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because there's other things in the world that I can care about instead. I have had battles with support about this kind of thing, and then I haven't, because if you're not going to cater to me, there's little chance that you're going to cater to me about other stuff as well. So generally speaking, if I cannot fill in a form that takes my needs into account, I'm not going to fill in your form, and therefore you're not going to capture my data. And please don't restrict the minimum length of a name. If you're doing it for search reasons, fix your search. There's better ways to do it than a 3-character like field in your store procedure. And this is a final note about how to store a name. There are limitations that seem to be a convention across the world of 25 for some reason. Don't use that. Van der Westhuizen is a very long surname. West is short, sure, but Van der Westhuizen is long. I have a friend whose last name is Depenthony space O'Kelly. That's a long name. And it's 2 words, but there's also a special character and a space. And the Depenthony is small d, e, and then capital P. It's a different name to what you'd expect to store, and it's long. So please don't use short fields for your names. You can use anything with a varchar in it, because varchars store whatever is in the field plus 2 bytes. If you watched my 8 KB session last month, you would know that it just needs however long the field is plus 2 bytes to store that data. So you can store West in 4 characters plus 2 for the database engine. That's 6 bytes. But you can also store Depenthony O'Kelly. You can also store these longer names and not worry about your storage issues too much. So please just use wider fields for names. Let's talk a little bit more about storing names. Please don't assume somebody's gender or sex from a name. What does that mean? Well, my name is Randolph. How many women do you know called Randolph? Well, I don't know any, but I'm also not a woman. I'm non-binary. I don't have a gender. Right? Unless you know that about me. So if you're looking at my name on a call sheet because you're the director of a movie or a TV show, and you see my name on a call sheet and you tell the assistant director to call me, and the assistant director says, "Hi, Randolph, how are you doing?" And I say, "I'm good." And she hears what sounds like a male name and then calls me he. That's unfortunate, and we don't want that. So don't assume a gender or a sex from somebody's name. And please don't split names on a space character. If you are storing a full name and then your fantastic developer logic says, right, well, after the first space, that'll be the first name, and then whatever's left over will be the surname. Okay, cool. What about Korean folks whose family names are first? So you're going to call everybody Park instead of what their actual first name is, which is after the space. Or they may have several names for their first name. They may have Van der Westhuizen, which is a great example. Is my husband's surname Westhuizen? Is it de Westhuizen or is it Van der Westhuizen? That's where West comes from, by the way. It's Westhouse, Westhuizen. Where does the surname start? Because there's a whole bunch of spaces in there. So please don't apply some logic that says, hi, whatever, or hi, Van, which is great. Hi, Van, here's your marketing email this week. Please don't split names and space characters. Don't dead name people. We already spoke about dead naming people. Always allow the ability for them to edit their names. Because here's the thing, guess what? People's names change. Do you know that one of our attendees got married in the last year and their name is their old name on Twitter and on a lot of emails, and they have to put their real name next to it. Instead of just, people get married, people get divorced, people change their gender, people transition. You need to be able to allow people to change their names. Yes, you do. I'm talking to you. Yes, you. You also need to provide Unicode support. We've spoken about this with people with different characters in their names. We've spoken about different languages. Turkish, for example, Greek, Russian. Even there was a great example that I read, which is the inverse of what I've been speaking about, where there's a person who's a Caucasian person who's been living in Japan for a number of years, and Japanese last names are usually only 2 to 4 characters long maximum, and all the databases cater to that. And if you've got somebody with a Western name that is longer than 4 characters, good luck. It's not going to fit, right? So this is something to keep in mind, even in different countries and where you're from. You have to think about these different considerations. And please, please, please allow for apostrophes, hyphens, and the word null, for example. If you are preventing somebody from using special characters in your form because there's an apostrophe and you're worried about SQL injection, you've got bigger problems. If you are not sanitizing your data before it goes into the database, using parameterization, you're doing it wrong. And if you think, oh, well, this is not important and people can just put a backslash, seriously? No. Fix your stuff. I would use a profanity here, but it's being recorded. Fix your stuff. Please sanitize your data. Please make sure that the data that people have typed in is the data you're actually putting into your database. Don't make people change their ways just because you were lazy as a developer. So how do you store pronouns? Well, you don't have to. If you want to, by all means, go ahead, but you don't have to. Make it a custom text field with suggestions. This means a little bit more work on the front end. So for example, if you have a form that you want people to fill in and you want to be inclusive, you would have, please put in your full name, please put in your preferred name, please put in your gender, and please put in your pronouns. Don't make it a drop down. And the reason for that is people change their minds and you won't include everyone. There will be a case where somebody feels excluded. And that has been an ongoing issue with the LGBTQIA2+ community. Did you hear how long that abbreviation is getting? The issue with names, the issue with words is that we cannot come up with names or words or descriptions or groups fast enough to make everybody feel included. So that's why we want to use umbrella words like queer or gay, because we think that that's better, but some people don't identify that way. And the case with genderqueer, for example, as a gender descriptor, it's the same with pronouns as well. But if I change my mind, then I should be able to store multiple values there. So you have to provide it as a custom text field and make a suggestion. So look, we know that 80 to 90% of the world doesn't know or care about pronouns. So that's why you don't want to make it recommended, or why you don't want to make it required. You do want to recommend it, but you don't want to make it required. So you would have, for example, full name, preferred name, and then gender, and then pronouns. And then under there, you would have a little pop-up or some sort of a user interface helper that says people usually type he/him or she/her or they/them. Right? And that's just to help somebody who doesn't understand what that field is for, and make it very clear that it's not required. Because you've got these required fields with a little red star, and making that a required field isn't helpful, because you're going to make people who don't care about pronouns feel upset about it for whatever reason. Please don't assume gender from pronouns. We already spoke about assuming gender from a name. Now you don't want to assume a gender from a pronoun. Just because my pronouns may be they or them doesn't mean that my gender is a gender. It might be something else. That goes for everyone. There are people who are watching this who have never thought about this before, and that's okay. That's why I put my email address on the first slide, so that you could actually speak to me if you need to and ask questions. Let's talk about storing gender and sex. It's not recommended at all unless it's legally required. Please don't store it unless you need to. Don't ask people if they're male or female or whatever unless you absolutely need to by law. Again, make it a custom text field with suggestions, and never ever use a Boolean value to store it. So you're going to be storing it as a text field. So what about fixing existing systems? Because we've got all of these pieces of advice, and yeah, but we've got systems that we need to fix, right? So let's talk about how you would take an existing database and adapt it to the new world order, the gay agenda. And we've got 20 minutes left, and this is probably not going to take 20 minutes, so there will be time for questions at the end. And if we finish a little bit earlier, that gives you the rest of your day, which I'm also okay with. So let's look at modifying name columns. So you've got your first and last name, and you need to create a full name. So create a full name column. And usually you'll just be copying the first and last name's content into it. Now, you may miss a trick here and do it wrong or backwards based on some people's names. And that's okay, because you're also going to send an email to your customer base saying, we've made some changes to our system. This is how we are storing your name. If it is incorrect, please log into the system and correct it. Simple. So to help them along, you're going to take whatever your first and last name content is, you're going to put a space between them and just dump it into the full name column. Then you're going to rename first name to preferred name. because generally speaking, people are going to put their preferred name in the first name column unless it's legally required. But also in that email that you're going to send to your customers, you're going to say, this is how we're storing your name. So what's going to happen here is that your last name or your family name, which is a much better word to describe what it is, will probably become nullable or empty. So you rename your last name or surname to family name and make it nullable, because some people have one name and that's it. So don't force them to fill it in. And please remove the minimum length restrictions. You may have it at a table level, you may have it in the application level, but please remove the minimum length restrictions. So when you look at your new name fields, you have added a new one called full name. You've renamed first name, you've renamed surname, and now you've got one extra column, the surname or the family name, which is probably going to be nullable. So it's not that much extra data that you're storing. It's a fairly small change. And by renaming fields in your application and in your database, you'll get around that. And if you need to, in the interim, you can use views so that your applications or stored procedures can talk to the views instead of the underlying table. But that's the goal that you're getting to. And of course, you're going to make your columns wider, because 25 characters for a surname is silly. And your full name should be, you can make an nvarchar 1024. Because you're not going to use 1,000 characters, but you are going to cater for people who do have long names that are 30, 40, 50 characters long. How do you modify sex and gender columns? Well, you need to stop using a Boolean value. So if you've got a gender column that says true or false, don't do that. You're going to create a new nvarchar column for gender. And this could be 255. I'm just using this as an example, but it can be wider than that. You're going to make the gender column nullable. All of them. I say all of them because you've still got the old column that was the true or false. So you're going to make that nullable firstly. And you're going to make the new one nullable as well, because unless by law you are required to store this information, generally with gender you're not obliged, then make it nullable so that you don't have to force people to fill it in. I've got a little asterisk there as well, which says unless legally mandated. So if you want to support people with multiple gender identities, so I may be a gender today and gender queer next week or gender fluid the following week, I might want all three of those. So you're going to have to create a cross-reference table. In other words, you create a table here with user ID, and you create a table here with gender ID, and then you do a cross-ref. And yes, then it's not a text field. Then you've got to do some logic that captures all the names and puts them into a drop-down list and all that kind of stuff, and then links them together. Or you can just do text field, user ID with a one-to-many link. Doesn't matter, but as long as you're catering to it with a cross-reference table, then you're catering to your users' wants and needs. The honorific lookup, or the title, it might be called a title in your database, you can convert that into a pronoun table, but again, you'd need to convert it from a lookup table into a free text field. Create a new pronoun column of nvarchar, whatever, get rid of that lookup title table and make it nullable too. This is fairly simple changes that you can make to your database to be a little bit more useful to your end users. And yes, you will get garbage data, so you need to handle it. What do I mean by garbage data? You're going to get people who are transphobic, who are going to say, I identify as an attack helicopter. And you're going to have to erase that data or ban them from your system, because people like that shouldn't be on your system. You're going to be a little bit more proactive in the way that you manage people's personal identifiable information. And yes, that happens all the time because people think they're funny. If you want to support people with multiple pronouns, so they, them, he, him, she, her, some people might identify by all of them. And so you'll need to create a cross-reference table again to store all of those different options. Might be easier not to store it at all, right? This one's an interesting one because the bullet points that I'm going to put here are obvious to you, but I want to make it very clear that what I've noticed as a consultant is that people confuse personal data with user data. User data is a user ID, when it was last modified, and whether they're allowed to log in or not. And then you'll have a different table which shows their roles and whether they have access to certain parts of the system. The only information you need to identify a user in your database is a user ID. You do not need to know that user ID 27 is Randolph West. You don't need to know that. You should store personal data in a different table to your user data. Don't create a wide user table, user ID 22, and then Randolph West, last logged in on this time, is allowed access to this stuff. Don't do that. Firstly, your user table needs to be as narrow as possible so that your queries are fast. You need to make sure that your database is as quick as it can be. And if you include personal data in your indexes, if you include personal data in the data that's coming back in a JSON query across the wire, you might be infringing on personal data requirements, right? So your user table should comprise as few columns as possible because it's probably being used in a bunch of places. So have a surrogate ID, a username, status, and a modified date. That's it. That's all you should have in a user table. Personal data should be stored in a separate table and only used when necessary. When you're showing it up on a profile page, when you're creating a report for insurance or financial reasons, stuff like that. And please don't sell personal data. I know this sounds obvious. It's probably illegal anyway. And what I don't mean sell as in got a bunch of data here that you might like. It will cost you 25 bucks. What I mean is giving third-party access to your data. If you are doing it for marketing reasons, stop that. If you're doing it for financial gain, stop that. If you have one of those legal documents on your page that says we reserve the right to share your data with third parties for whatever reasons, make sure those are the right reasons. And the reason for that is because if you followed a fellow MVP called Troy Hunt, who created a system called Have I Been Pwned, a lot of databases will be stolen. Whether you like it or not, your data will be acquired by somebody. And if you make that harder to do by not sharing your databases with other people and then them having a copy of it on an open AWS bucket, which has happened more often than you'd like to think, the better for everyone. So if you're going to share data with other people, please anonymize it. And if they really need to know stuff like gender, sex, and social security numbers or whatever, then make sure that it is done in a secure way, because data is very valuable and selling data is bad. Remember to encrypt your data, basically. Alrighty, we have just about 10, 12 minutes left. There's time for questions. If you don't have too many questions, that's okay, because like I said, this session was invented for this conference and I wasn't sure how long it would take. So please feel free and ask questions, and I'm gonna stop screen sharing if I can remember how to find that button.